out here at first negative speaker, and I'm wondering, what is the affirmative actually proposing? There's been a fundamental lack of clarity in the set out first affirmative. We haven't heard which particular graduates they're talking about. They're talking about postgraduates, they're talking about people who have graduated and stay in New Zealand and then get repaid for their fees. We really don't know where we're at. And the fact is already that the government does a whole lot to increase the availability of tertiary education to the citizens of Aotearoa. It's easily accessible to us now because it's subsidised and we have interest-free student loans. And the affirmative proposal is vague, costly and ineffectual, and for these reasons we must not implement it. So what will I be doing today? Firstly, I'll be addressing the problem proposed by the affirmative. Secondly, addressing the point of this will be cost to the economy. My three substantive points: that this actually isn't an incentive. This has huge costs and practical ramifications associated with it. And thirdly, that there's actually one tangible detriment, and that is, instead of providing a more educated citizenry, this will actually devalue degrees. The second speaker will address the issue of brain drain and further analyse this concept of incentives. So basically, the affirmative have come out here and said that people leaving is such a big cost to our economy, and basically his justification for this was that we have to employ overseas people, somehow we have to pay them more, and this is costing our economy badly. We haven't heard any analysis or any justification of why this actually costs our economy so much. Essentially what they're doing here is lamenting the fact that New Zealand can't supply everything. New Zealand is an economy of 4 million. We can't exploit economies of scale, and we don't have specialists in every area. So the fact that we are importing specialists is actually increasing our availability to services, because New Zealand, quite honestly, ladies and gentlemen, can't supply all these specialists that they're talking about. So, to be quite honest, we can't see where the cost of the economy is coming from, and that hasn't been analysed sufficiently. So to the larger point of why this actually isn't an incentive for people to stay in New Zealand. No, thank you, sir. Let's analyse the role of tertiary education fees. Over the last 10 years, there's been a huge push by the Labour government for people to enter tertiary education, to increase labour productivity. Essentially, university numbers have increased because there's been this huge drive, increasing subsidies, and huge push for people to go into tertiary education. So if all these people are willing to go to university, that means they're willing to pay the fees. These people aren't hindered by paying the fees. That means the fees for these people aren't a disincentive at all. And now what the affirmative is trying to do is turn this and use it as an incentive. But the fact that it hasn't disincentivised people from going to university in the first place means that this isn't going to have any effect on them at all. No, thank you. So, using this logic, basically, if people aren't disincentivised by the fees, they won't be incentivised to go to university. So let's have a look at an example. Let's a hypothetical example of a graduate who's decided to go overseas because of greater work prospects and better job opportunities. He's already paid his university fees and he's already determined to go overseas. So, will the affirmative proposal of saying, hey, we're going to give you your university fees free if you stay here, is that enough to change his course and change his decision and change his plan to stay in New Zealand when there are greater job prospects and opportunities, as admitted by the affirmative speakers? Sure.
Are you saying that the government subsidy that you say provided, do you think that would provide enough incentive for them to stay in New Zealand?
Well, yes, it has provided enough incentive because university numbers have been on the rise for the past 10 years. Thank you, sir.
On that point, sir.
No, thanks. So let's move on to the next point of practicalities, and this is a biggie. Like, really, how the hell is this going to work? Okay, they're saying you can sign a contract, trap yourself in New Zealand for 15 years with the prospect of not having to pay back like 40 grand over 10 years, like what's that? Like 4 grand a year. I mean, really, how big an incentive is this? And more importantly, the fact that the affirmative is trying to target highly educated workers who have huge job prospects and huge opportunities overseas, to say, hey, sign this contract, you're going to trap yourself in New Zealand for 15 years with much lower average wages than basically everywhere else. Do you think anyone is going to do this? Is this going to be effective? And the answer is no, because even people who aren't necessarily the most skilled and don't have the biggest prospects aren't going to trap themselves in New Zealand for 15 years. It's not feasible, ladies and gentlemen, because the fact is, as many of you here probably know, careers can take many turns and lives can take many turns, and to expect graduates, really, to predict what's going to happen in the next 15 years of their life is just simply ridiculous. And for that reason alone, the affirmative proposal cannot stand, because people won't sign this contract. Furthermore, what if people do sign this contract and then go overseas? What's going to happen? They're going to track their credit cards, apparently, and say to the EU, actually, he's ours, can you please send him back? Like, really? We haven't seen any way in which this is going to be enforced. We haven't seen any punishment system, because for all I know, if I go overseas having signed this contract and they say, please come back, and I say no, what's going to happen? I'll probably stay there earning sort of 10 times the amount in the EU than I would staying in New Zealand for the next 15 years of my life. So, affirmative team, please tell us what's going to happen to people who violate this contract, assuming, of course, they're going to sign it, which won't happen. So let's have a look at this aspect of cost, which they actually haven't addressed. I mean, they said it's economically feasible. Let's look at what tertiary education actually is. We're looking at a huge umbrella of things. We're looking at institutes of technology. We're looking at universities. We're looking at correspondence schools. We're looking at trade schools. Like audio engineering, for example, is a tertiary education facility. So really, we have the majority of people coming out of school with any sort of qualification going into a tertiary education sector. So you can imagine, this is assuming, of course, that people are going to sign the contract. This is hypothetical. The fact that if they do sign this contract, trap themselves in New Zealand for 15 years, then we're going to pay for basically everyone who goes through all these institutions. We're going to pay all of their university fees. Think about that. Think about that on an ongoing basis, ladies and gentlemen. The cost is quite simply phenomenal. And more importantly, the government isn't in a position to launch such a highly costly initiative, because we have a huge current account deficit, and whatever the amount of budget surplus we do have is spent on paying back ancient debts from sheikhs in Arabia from the 70s. So the fact is that we have no money, really, to address such a huge initiative as this. And even if we did, the fact is that we have better things to spend it on, namely New Zealand's deteriorating health sector and mile-long waiting queues. My third substantive point, which Alex is going to touch on briefly. If this does work, and if this does create a huge influx of people into tertiary education, that isn't a good thing. That doesn't lead to a more educated citizenry. What that actually does is means that everybody has a degree. Let's look at a bit of supply and demand here. If you up the supply and everyone's got a degree, that means that it's actually not that valuable anyway. And this just makes it so much more difficult for employers and so much more difficult for employees to get a job, because everyone has a BCom LLB, ladies and gentlemen, and they don't know who's good to work at Russell McVeigh. So, essentially, this is going to be continued by the second negative speaker as to why exactly shoving a whole lot more people through tertiary education, assuming that they lock themselves in this country for 15 years, is actually a bad thing, and it's not going to increase productive capacity, it's not going to increase labour productivity, and for that reason, this is a significant detriment. What have I done? I've addressed the problem and the lack of substantiation thereof. Additionally, I've addressed why this isn't actually an incentive at all, because there's a 15-year period and no one will sign it. It's ineffectual. And I've also outlined the significant detriment of increasing tertiary education, decreasing the value of degrees. And actually, what's the result, ladies and gentlemen? The result is zero, and for that reason, the moot must fall.